Top 10 least favorite levels was one of my favorite lists of 2014. It was good for the time, and I had a lot of fun making it. And for a while, I really wanted to remake that list, and now I figured it's the time to do that. If you're wondering why this is a top 11 instead of a top 10, it's because, well, there were 11 levels that I wanted to talk about. The rules here are simple, one per franchise and only games I've played. Also, unlike some of my other remakes, I will be including levels that were on the other list as well. So with all that said, let's begin. You know, I would say that Flood Town is probably my least favorite area in Infamous 2. Not only is it kind of depressing, but it's also a pain to navigate because of all the water. But don't worry, I'm not putting all of Flood Town on this list. That would be kinda silly. Because while for the most part this place is fine and just not as good as the others, Burning Wells has some serious explaining to do. Is Burning Wells a hard mission? No, not really, but it sure as heck is annoying. Basically, the premise of this mission is that the Icemen have lit all the wells in Flood Town on fire. Yeah, that's right, the people with ice powers are lighting things on fire. That's kind of like a peanut butter wizard trying to kill you with jelly. But I digress. Basically, what you have to do is get the well cap around to all 3 wells to put out the fires. Yes, I said the well cap, as in yes, there is only one of them. And let me tell you, these wells aren't exactly close together. Basically, when you get to the well cap, you have to pick it up and fling it a great distance and hope it lands somewhere near the well. Obviously, if you're near the well, you can lift up the cap and place it on. They're not that cruel. But here's probably the biggest problem with this mission. The water. For those of you who've never played the first 2 Infamous games, water will kill you if you're in it for too long. And as you would imagine, due to the large abundance of it, the well cap falls into the water quite frequently. I'm not going to act like this would be better in any of the other areas. In fact, it would probably be worse because the skyscrapers would make the mission borderline impossible, but that fact doesn't make this level any less annoying. But even without the water, it's still not that good of a mission. I mean, who on the dev team thought to themselves, oh yeah, we should totally have this mission where you're lugging this big well cap around and have to put out various fires? Maybe it's just me, but even in concept, that mission doesn't sound fun, let alone the mediocre execution that they gave it. However, I do gotta give this game props. This is the only mission in the game that I remember not liking. Out of every level on this list, the Ark of Yamato is easily the laziest. Now, before I start this off, I think I should just say I don't necessarily mind final levels that repeat parts of earlier in the game. Honestly, I think it's a really good way to go if the developers are creative and put effort into it, like with Treacherous Mansion from Luigi's Mansion Dark Moon. Here, though, we got the exact opposite end of the spectrum. How so? Simple. This level is literally just fight 5 of the previous bosses in the game and then go fight the final boss. And guess what? No changes were made to any of the bosses either. I will say though, I do think it's ridiculous that the Altart complained about Lechku and Nechku not being here. Why? Because you literally just fought them before coming in. Now you could argue that it is nice to go back and refight all these bosses, but I dare you to make that argument with Orochi. First time around, I loved the fight with Orochi. Second and third times around, I friggin' hated it. I still don't get why they thought it was a good idea to put him in the Ark in the first place. By this point, you've already fought him twice, and the second time wasn't even that long ago. Not to mention the length of the fight is about the same as the length of the other 4 fights in the Ark combined. Although I will say, at least when this tedious nightmare is over, you get to fight one of the greatest final bosses in all of gaming. However, this is probably the laziest red carpet rollout for said final boss they could have possibly done. You know, in Kid Icarus Uprising, the RM story arc is pretty pointless and pretty much just there to pad out the game's chapter count to 25. I mean, you could take these 3 chapters out entirely, and aside from RM enemies appearing later, nothing would change. This might seem like I hate the RM arc, but I don't, because most of the levels in it were actually pretty fun. Well, except for the RM brain, of course. Yeah, this is the only level in the game that I legitimately don't like. You know, interestingly enough, Chapter 17 is the only chapter in the game I didn't like, and 17 is my favorite number. That statement didn't pertain to anything else in this entry, but then again, the RM chapters didn't pertain to anything else in Kid Icarus Uprising, so you know what? It fits. Okay, enough stupid forced metaphors. Let's get on to why this chapter is so bad. Now, there's nothing really wrong with the flying portion of this level. It's when you get to the ground area where the problems start to arise. As you've probably noticed by looking at this footage, you only have one platform to stand on. Oh, what's that? You wanted to traverse through a big level while fighting the enemies? Screw that! Stay in this one place and wait for all the enemies to come to you. I'm well aware that the Chaos Vortex did something similar, but A, they gave you more space, and B, it felt like an epic enemy gauntlet with enemies from all across the game, not just one type. Oh, but those aren't the only problems we have to deal with. This is also an escort mission. Now, it's far from the worst escort mission I've ever played. Trust me, we'll get to that later. But it's definitely not good. Basically, the Centurions are carrying you, and you have to kill the enemies before they can kill the Centurions. Terrible? No, but it's still far from fun. But the one thing that this level has in common with the other RM chapters is the lack of fun boss battles. I'm not going to comment much on RM Pyron because he's not frustrating or anything, he's just not that interesting. Overall, this level was bland, frustrating, and like I said earlier, pertained absolutely nothing to the main story. I'd say it could be removed completely and nothing would change, but then we would lose the other two RM levels, and who wants that? Oh great, bringing home the bacon's up next. You see, my biggest regret from my original version of this list is leaving this level off of it. You see, this level isn't frustrating or unfair, but it sure as heck is boring. You know, I'd say the biggest reason why this level's boring, but I think the game does a great job of explaining it for me.
How's it going?
Well, instead of searching for Rhett's fury, I'm searching for a key to some overalls which smell so bad they were locked in a cupboard. And I'm doing that so I can catch some pigs.
Oh, well, you can probably use your audio scanner to find the pigs.
Oh, well now everything's okay.
Yeah, that's right. Instead of progressing with the main story, Dunby decides to punish you and makes you go round up pigs. Aside from the rural locale being far less interesting than Lego City, what you're doing is just boring compared to the rest of the game. Some of the other levels involve you breaking into a mobster's scrapyard, stealing a lunar rover from Apollo Island, and robbing a bank, all with a good helping of car chases mixed in. Heck, even the first level that's just supposed to be easing you into things has you chase down bank robbing clowns at the end of it. Here though, you're just chasing down pigs. Not only that, but I really don't like the music in this level. I know it's just personal taste and it is fitting for the area, but I still just don't really like it. But the level's not just bad from a conceptual level, it's also bad from a gameplay level. It has a brand of platforming that I like to call reset platforming. What is reset platforming? Well, you've probably already encountered it and just don't know what I'm talking about yet. Reset platforming is when a level's designed so terribly that you can easily fall off something that took freaking forever to climb up and you have to do it all over again. Not really contributing a lot of challenge, but a lot of annoyance. I think the reason why I spared this level last time is that I felt it really was trying to be entertaining. I mean, for God's sake, this is the first time in quite a while that you get to see Frank in person, and he has some freaking hilarious lines.
Chase! My horse is stuck in reverse! And it doesn't have a head! And it has a really weird-looking butt! You're sat facing backwards, Frank.
Oh! That'd explain why he didn't like it when I fed him that apple!
But I'm sorry, not even Frank's hilarious lines are enough to save this level from its frustrating gameplay and boring concept. Oh, a bad level from Super Paper Mario. You'd probably think I'd be putting Chapter 2-3 on this list, right? Don't get me wrong, it's a terrible, awful, stupid level that's one of the dumbest ideas for a level I've seen in any video game. But if you look up the code to Mimi's safe online, you can bypass the entire thing. Well, all the repetitive stuff at least. Point is, it is a terrible level, but the game lets you skip almost all of it. The same cannot be said for Chapter 6. Now, I know a lot of people are going to get mad about this, and let me just say, story Story-wise, Chapter 6 is one of the best chapters in the game. The twist that it pulls is a big shock to the system and adds a lot of tension to the story. Gameplay-wise, on the other hand, it's easily the worst. So what is it that you do in this chapter exactly? Well, Chapter 1 has you take out 100 fighters in a fighting gauntlet. All these fights have a lot of dialogue before and after, and there's barely anything to these fights themselves. Thank God the gauntlet gets cut short at 20 because Count Bleck jumps in to essentially say, hey, I'm about to destroy your world. Oh yeah, and a lot of deep character-driven stuff too. The second level isn't really even a level, it's just a boss fight. You have a quick fight with Mimi, and then the void destroys the entire world. And then we get to what's both the best and the worst part of the chapter. On one hand, it shows just how lifeless Sammer's kingdom is now, and that this will happen to everywhere if you don't stop Count Bleck. On the other hand, you have to hold right for 2 minutes straight while seeing almost nothing and doing nothing else. That is, of course, until you meet up with Mr. L and have a quick fight with him. Like I said, I know a lot of people are going to disagree with me because this chapter does a great job of telling the story of Super Paper Mario, but at the same time, the gameplay is just so boring I can't give it a pass. You know, if you asked me what the worst part of No More Heroes 2 is, I would tell you it's easily the part of the game where you have to play as Shinobu. And I really don't think I'm alone on that, because aside from the final boss, the Shinobu segments are easily the most infamous part of the game. The two bosses you fight as her, Million Gunman and New Destroyman, are considered two of the worst bosses in the entire series. But those are just the bosses. Despite not being talked about that much, the levels are no better. Case in point, New Destroyman stage. You know, I really wouldn't blame any of you for disagreeing with me on this, because there are a lot of terrible levels in No More Heroes 2. From the agonizing parking lot fight in Margaret's stage, to Alice's stage being the most unreasonably long level I've ever played, to, you know, the other Shinobu level, really the only level in the game that stands out in a positive way to me, ironically enough, is Jasper's level. But enough with the laundry list of terrible levels. What makes this level specifically so bad? Well, actually, it ties into why Shinobu never should have been a playable character in the first place. You see, this level revolves around platforming, but not just any kind of platforming. Our good old friend reset platforming. However, reset platforming isn't the only problem with the platforming in this level. It's also the fact that it's platforming in a game that was not in any way designed for platforming. You see, when a lot of people play as Shinobu, they're distracted by the fact that she taunts after every single combo, which, don't get me wrong, is a very valid thing to get mad at. But believe it or not, that little quirk isn't included in easy mode. On the one hand, it made the fight with New Destroyman miles more bearable for me, but on the other hand, it also gave me a front row seat to just how terrible the jumping controls are. But probably the worst part of the level is how confusing it is. You see, there's no clear path to New Destroyman, and everything looks the same. It's so bad that I had to look up a guide to beat the level. Yeah, that's right, I had to look up a guide to beat a level in a freaking beat-em-up game. That's a sign of failure if I've ever seen one. Okay, here we are, back at the strangest difficulty spike I've ever seen in a video game. The Hanging Gardens from Blob. When you first get there, you're greeted by everything being covered in ink. For those who've never played Blob, if you fall in ink, you only have a certain amount of time to get into some water before you die. So as you would imagine, getting through a level covered in this stuff wouldn't be challenging in the slightest. There are pumps that you can use to drain the ink, thank God, but even still, every time you go onto a new area, it's going to be filled with ink. If that was all you had to deal with in this level, that would be one thing, but there's many other things you have to deal with in this level as well. This level also has some of the toughest enemies in the game, including hordes of inky elites, the guys with the ink flamethrowers, and worst of all, the ink snipers. It's at its worst when they're shooting at you while you're along narrow ledges above the ink. It's really hard to focus on both getting out of their range and not falling into the ink, which has caused me many deaths in this level. Now I know what those of you who haven't seen my original list are thinking. Defossilizer, you've just been saying how this level's hard, not how it's bad. But here's the thing. This is the hardest level in the game, and it's placed right smack in the middle of it. Yeah, that's right. I found all the levels after this one easier. The only ones that even came close for me were the Ministry of Ink and Lake Radia, and even then, those are the two last levels in the game, so it's warranted. Here though, this level of difficulty is certainly not warranted, and the funny thing is, if they had made this one of the last 3 levels in the game, it wouldn't be on this list at all. But since it's such a brutal and stupid difficulty spike, I just had to put it on the list. You know, one level type you see in a lot of video games are levels that are so dark that you need some sort of gimmick to see where you're going. It's not my favorite level type in the world or anything, but it can lead to some pretty entertaining and fun levels. That is, of course, if they know what they're doing and they're making stuff impossible to see on purpose. The point I'm getting at is that the Kelp Forest is not a good level. Why is it so bad? Well, maybe it's because of the fact it's so dark you can't see a thing. Now I know what some of you guys are thinking. Defossilizer, this doesn't look that bad. You really need to get your eyes checked. Well, first off, I have 20/20 vision, thank you very much, but secondly, it doesn't look that bad on a computer, but for some reason on a TV, it does look really hard to see. And honestly, I don't know why that difference is, or why this level's so dark to begin with. I mean, the Flying Dutchman's graveyard is supposed to be this dark, spooky graveyard, yet there's no issues there. This level, on the other hand, is really dark, everything blends together, and it's really hard to see what you're doing. This level also involves precision platforming with these tiny leaves that, once again, blend into everything. I honestly gave up at the part where you had to find a bunch of stone tikis with Patrick. They're spread out all over the place and are really hard to find. It might seem harsh to put the Kelp Forest this high on the list, but when I can't see what the heck I'm supposed to be doing, not because of a clever level gimmick, but because of terrible art direction, I find that freaking infuriating. You know, one thing that I think's really important in a video game is how you start it off. You want to have something exciting or at least entertaining at the beginning of the game and also explain how to play in a non-intrusive way. In other words, no excessive tutorials. I'm looking straight at you, Dream Team. But I think the most important part is not having it go on too long and getting you into the meat of the gameplay pretty quickly. I bring this up because Kingdom Hearts 2 has quite possibly the worst beginning to any video game I've ever played. What's wrong with this whole sequence in Twilight Town? Well, let me tell you. You see, this whole sequence centers around Roxas and his friends and their life in Twilight Town. Now, this would make a lot of sense for setting up the main character to go on his journey. There's only one problem with that, though. Roxas isn't the main character of the game. Sora is, and after this big introductory sequence, Roxas vanishes from the rest of the game up until the final level, aside from occasional references to him. Not to mention, this sequence is full of plot points that don't make any sense unless you've played Chain of Memories. I get that Chain of Memories takes place in between 1 and 2, but it was also a spin-off. They seriously didn't have the decency to explain what happened to the people who either A, couldn't put up with the battle system, or B, didn't get the whole timeline thing with the games. Not to mention, in the opening of this combat-centered game, the amount of times you actually do combat are very few and far between. But wanna know what the worst part is? Like, the absolute worst part of all of this? Wanna know how long it takes from when you start the game until you get to play as Sora and actually get into the meat of the gameplay? Cause I'll tell you, 3 hours. 3 freaking hours! I'm not kidding. In my notes, I have this level labeled as 3-hour-long tutorial, because that's what it is. Granted, it might not be that long, depending on how you play, but it's still gonna take freaking forever. And for those of you who are going to be saying, oh, but this is very important for Roxas's character. Didn't he have his own game? Why does he need to take up the opening 3 hours of Kingdom Hearts 2, a game that he barely has any impact on the rest of? So yeah, this level is pretty much the textbook definition of how not to start off a video game. But I'll give Kingdom Hearts 2 this. While it certainly doesn't know crap about how to start off a video game, it certainly knows how to end one, which is something the next entry could definitely learn from. Longtime viewers of mine, you know exactly where I'm going with this. You know, something that's just as important to a game as a good opening level is a good final level. It should be something satisfying to make you feel good about seeing the game all the way through to the end. The best way to go about it is by combining most of the stuff that made the game great in the first place to make it a really satisfying finisher to the game. Or alternatively, you could do the polar opposite of that and get the meat circus. Those of you who know my channel well know that there's 3 things that I rant about so much it's practically a running gag: Paper Mario Sticker Star, game theory, and this freaking level. But considering that this is the most appropriate time for me to be ranting on this level, don't expect me to pull any punches out of fear of being repetitive. The first area is nothing but a tease. It makes you feel like you're about to enter this big, epic, fun final level when really all you're getting is pain. To start things off when they get actual content, we have the worst escort mission I've ever played in a video game. You see, there's this kid, Little Oli, and he loves bunnies, and you need to help him catch his bunnies. You also need to stop him from getting beaten to death by these hellish bunny monsters that come out of meat grinders. And every time you get this kid his bunny, the idiot flies up to a higher level, puts his bunny down, and puts himself in Harb's way. Hey idiot, if you can fly, then fly out of the tent that has the monstrous killer jackrabbits in it. He claims there's multiple bunnies, but it's clearly just one. Gameplay wise, you have to make your way to him across this really difficult platforming that also implements reset platforming once again. It wouldn't be this bad except for A, this is miles harder than anything else you've had to put up with in this game, and B, there's a time limit. That time limit, of course, being getting to Little Oli before he gets beaten to death. I swear, the part where you have to get the knife thrower to throw daggers at the spinning wheels so you can swing off of them is freaking ridiculous. I swear, if it weren't for the safety nets, I don't know if I would have ever beaten this part. Next, we get to the completely unforgiving grind rail segment, known ironically as the Tunnel of Love. I seriously don't understand if the developers intended you to get all the figments without dying. Then you get to the big top with a somewhat easy fight with the Butcher. It is a bit annoying, but it's still pretty easy. Then you meet up with Raz's dad, who takes you through the most infamous part of this entire level, the rising water segment. Basically, the water in the room starts rising, and you have to go through the most brutal platforming in the game to avoid drowning. Now, in concept, this is actually a really good idea, taking all the platforming skills you've accumulated throughout the game and putting them to the test in one final stretch. The problem is that this is miles harder than anything else in the game outside of the meat circus, and I get it, games are supposed to get harder as you go along, but not by this much. Point is, it should be the hardest part of the game, but not by the insane margin that it is. Right after that nightmare, you get a fight with Raz's dad and the Butcher working together, which, guess what? Actually makes them easier. Talk about failed partnerships. And then you get the fight with the two-headed dad monster, which honestly is probably the most pathetic final boss fight I've ever faced. All you do is run away from the boss and avoid its actually pretty easy to dodge attacks until your power builds up and then you can attack it. Want to know a fun fact about this level though? I'm actually describing the fixed version to you guys. The original version of the game actually had the meat circus even harder. The level was so bad that they had to fix it up in a re-release. So in other words, this is the Psychonauts equivalent of the water temple. And I've actually done some digging to see what they changed because there's barely any information about it on the internet. The only thing I could find was that in this game, when you get hit by the water, you lose some health, while in the original, you lose a life. Overall, the meat circus is a perfect storm for a terrible level. It manages to be simultaneously way harder and way easier than it should be. It introduces a kinda new character who makes part of the level a living nightmare for you, and despite all the extreme difficulty, this level actually feels really short and unepic. Considering the fact that Psychonauts had some of the best levels I've played in any video game, it's really disappointing that the final level to end it all off was so bad. Although I will give this level credit for a few things. First off, the music that plays in this level is one of my favorite tracks in the game. Also, I really liked the reunion between Raz and his father. Also, while a massive difficulty spike in a platformer is pretty bad, there are genres where it could be even worse, like say, an RPG? You know, one thing about remakes on my channel is that I don't like to have the same #1 for both versions. Point is, I didn't want to make this video until I could find something that was worse than the meat circus. But I found that something, alright. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the Wellspring Desert. I really hate this level. The first thing I should mention about this area is that it once again is a massive difficulty spike. Chances are you're not gonna be fully prepared when you show up to the Wellspring Desert. Simply put, the enemies here are freaking brutal. There are 3 basic types of enemies here. All are probably going to be way stronger than you're ready to handle. First off, there's the cactuses, which there's not really anything special about, but they're still hard. The Maraca Cobras, on the other hand, have a very difficult gimmick to get around. Basically, they can constrict your party members and prevent them from moving on that turn. So, if you don't outnumber them, you're pretty much screwed. And then there's the vacant vultures. Oh boy, the vacant vultures. They don't attack often, but when they do, it can be enough to almost KO you. Now I know what you guys are thinking. To Fawfalizer, you're being ridiculous. The guy in the footage here isn't having that tough a time at all. You're just really under leveled. Well, here's the thing. You can easily beat this level if you simply adopt the playstyle of use the same 3 characters for the entire game, which is not something I like to do, and in my personal opinion, kind of defeats one of the purposes of this game. I like to switch characters out and experiment with their different abilities. Sure, it means a little extra grinding, but it's worth it because it's more fun. However, this level's a massive difficulty spike compared to all the stuff earlier. Sure, you can use the only use 3 people strategy, but that just means you can steamroll through this area and make it way too easy. In other words, the opposite problem. But know what the worst part of this level is? It's that you can get here early, by accident. Yeah, that's right. You can get to the Wellspring Desert all the way from Sugar Flats, which, trust me, is way earlier than you're supposed to be there. Plus, aside from the music and terrain change, there's nothing that indicates you just entered the Wellspring Desert. So how is this level worse than the Meat Circus, a level that I specifically said was the perfect storm for a terrible level? First off, while both these levels are brutal difficulty spikes, the Meat Circus only asks that your skills magically improve astronomically. That's certainly not a good thing, but it's a lot better than expecting you to either grind for an hour or play the entire game with a strategy that makes it significantly less fun. Secondly, the Meat Circus did have some redeeming qualities like the music and Raz's reunion with his dad. The Wellspring Desert has no such redeeming qualities, unless you count the casino, but I don't. I just consider that its own separate level. If anything, the casino makes it worse, because that means you have to trek all the way back through the Wellspring Desert if you ever want to go back there. Third, and this one's obvious, you can't just stumble into the Meat Circus before you're supposed to be there. Like I said before with the Wellspring Desert though, that's entirely possible. Fourth, while it's not often and probably only in the fixed version, there are moments where the Meat Circus shows mercy on you. There is no such mercy in the Wellspring Desert. Fifth, I know this one's just personal opinion, but due to having played it multiple times, I've at least gotten used to the badness of the Meat Circus. And lastly, I know this is a weird thing to be praising, but the Meat Circus gets everything wrong. Like I said before, it's the perfect storm for a terrible level. It's at least interestingly bad. It's actually fun to rant on, and it's cool to look at all the factors that just go into this abomination of a level. The Wellspring Desert isn't even interestingly bad though. It just has a bunch of enemies that are miles tougher than they should be, and a layout that makes it hard to navigate around them. Why do you think I spent the majority of this entry comparing the Wellspring Desert to the Meat Circus instead of focusing on the Wellspring Desert itself? Because there's barely anything to say about the Wellspring Desert itself. Thanks to this, I was actually apprehensive about putting this level at number 1, but whenever I looked back on it, I remembered, yeah, it gave me way more frustration than the Meat Circus ever did. I am Defawfalizer, and be sure to let me know in the comments what levels you really hate. I'd love to hear about it.